Hello, and today we're reviewing the Skil LH0300D 12V or 20V collapsible lantern. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot, and it's sort of a cool system here. Now, I'm going to be using 12V batteries for this particular light since that's actually the only Skil batteries that I own, but you can actually use 20V batteries to power this light as well. When it comes to 12V batteries, there is quite a bit of looseness and play, but there isn't enough for the light to, well, power down or for the battery to become detached, so it's still an acceptable performance. I did accidentally turn off the light in the video, but that was my own fault and not the fault of the, well, loose battery. So while the 12V batteries do wiggle back and forth quite a bit, there isn't enough to affect the overall performance of the light. Just keep in mind that the light can still power on without the battery being fully inserted into the slot, so just make sure that the battery is always fully inserted and locked into place before hanging it above your head in a tent, otherwise you might wake up with a nasty bump on your head. And when it comes to runtime, Skil is estimating that you're going to get about 5.5 hours of runtime using a 12V 2Ah battery, and I think that's a fairly accurate assessment. But also keep in mind that that's going to be on the high mode, and if you want a longer runtime, you can switch it to the low mode, which is 50 lumens versus the high mode's 300 lumens, and that should give you a substantially longer runtime, which will be good for emergency situations. So for the most part, everything on this particular light battery slot is fine, and the battery life is fairly good as well. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the light. Okay, next up we have the hanging hook. The hanging hook is made out of metal that has been painted black, and it will fold up into the hanging position when you need to use it, and when you don't need to use it, you can simply fold the hook down and then slide the hook into the body of the light for easy transportation. Now, the metal that they used for the hook is definitely going to be a little bit on the softer side, and I personally would have liked to have seen them use something that was a little bit more rigid and wasn't as easily prone to bending as the hook that we got here. As long as you don't force it, you're not going to have any issues, but if you do end up forcing it, make sure that you don't overcorrect and bend too much in the opposite direction, because you can only bend metal so many times. Now, when it comes to the clearance in between the battery and the hook, it does seem to work best with 2Ah batteries in both the 12V and 20V lineup. I think that it still has an acceptable performance with the 12V 4Ah battery, but if you are going to plan, or if you are planning on using it with the larger 20V 4Ah or 5Ah battery, there might not be very much clearance, if any clearance at all, to speak of in between the well hook and the battery. So your usage there may vary, and I am unable to test it since I own neither one of those batteries. But as it stands, as a 12V light, everything here seems to work just fine, and I don't really have any major complaints, other than the fact that I wish they would have went with a slightly stronger metal for the hook. But that's just sort of being nitpicky, and at least they didn't go with plastic, which would have been a far worse option. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the power button. The power button is located on the rear of the tool on the right side and is a simple cycle through design. You press the button once to turn the light onto the low mode, which is 50 lumens. You press it again to turn onto the high mode, which is going to be 300 lumens, and then you press it a third time in order to turn off the light. There is no hidden strobe function or any other functions that will become activated by holding the power button. As a matter of fact, it does absolutely nothing and is a complete waste of time. So remember, you will have to cycle through all the different modes regardless of what mode you're on. But since there's only two modes, it's not really that big of a deal. Now, the estimated runtime with this particular light is going to be 5.5 hours on high using a 12V 2Ah battery, and so that's a fairly decent performance. So this might be a decent light to consider if you're in an emergency situation or you need a campsite beacon. If you do end up using this as a campsite beacon for, well, you know, those potty trips in the middle of the night, just remember that this is not a waterproof light and you should stick it inside a Ziploc bag. So yeah, that's about the sum of it. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the USB port. The USB port is located right next to the power button and has a rubber flat that covers it. It is the USB-C port, and it can be used to charge your phone or other small electronics such as flashlights or small fans. There is no PD power delivery as far as I'm aware of on this particular USB-C port, so it can really only be used effectively to charge small devices and is not suitable for laptop computers, although you could probably use it to charge small tablets. So with that being said, it's a fairly effective design and I don't really have any major complaints. So yeah, that's about the sum of it. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the LED light. Now, the LED light is going to be powered by 9 LED beads on top of a white PCB board that is located underneath the white diffuser that has been permanently attached. Now, the diffuser on this particular light is translucent and made out of a fairly thick silicone material that does a fairly decent job at, well, spreading the light in a 360 pattern around this particular tool when it has been fully extended. Now, the material is fairly robust and you won't have to worry about it opening on its own. It takes a little bit of force to pull it forward to get to open up, and when you collapse it in, it will stay collapsed in without you having to worry about it falling free when you're transporting the light or anything like that. And when it comes to the kind of light that this particular tool is producing, it's fairly neutral. It's got a little bit of a warm hue to it, but it's not nearly as warm as some of the Makita lights I've reviewed in the past, so I'm fairly happy with the overall performance here. And like I said earlier, on low mode it produces 50 lumens, and on high mode it produces 300 lumens. So it's a fairly average performance for a tool in this category. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Without a battery, the light weighs 178 grams, which is about 0.4 pounds. And with a 2 amp hour 12 volt battery, it weighs about 1 pound. So it's a very lightweight light. Okay, let's talk a little bit about my thoughts on this particular light. And I have to say that I actually really do kind of like this particular light. I like the fact that it does a fairly good job at illuminating the area around the light, and I like the fact that it can be so compact when you collapse the diffuser in on itself. I like the fact that it has the USB port, and it does have a decent enough hook for hanging, although I do wish that that was a little bit more rigid. But with that being said, I don't think that this is going to necessarily be the best light to work on, well, let's say your projects with. I think that the amount of light that this produces is going to be good enough for working underneath your sink or in tight spaces, say your crawl space or attic. And if you just need an all-night light for when you're camping, just bring along a couple 2 amp hour batteries, and each one should give you about a night's worth of, well, light on low settings so that you don't get lost in the middle of the woods after you put your fire out, if you're allowed to have a fire. So I think there are definitely really good use case scenarios for this particular light. And also, I think it's a good light to have in case of an emergency because, well, you've got the USB port on the light, the USB port on the battery, and it can have the ability to basically run all night long on the low settings. So if you leave this in the middle of your house so you can see where you're going, there's less of a chance that you're going to end up tripping over something and hurting yourself. So I think it's a decent enough light, and I think there's a lot of different use case scenarios and a lot of different ways of using this particular light. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not a half bad tool to consider. My biggest gripe right now is the fact that it's currently only being sold in a tool pack, and I wouldn't mind picking up 1 or 2 more of these particular lights for, well, use in certain situations. So when they do end up finally releasing this particular light as a tool only option, I will probably end up picking up a couple more. But with that being said, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. And the first pro would be 12 volts or 20 volt, which means that this can be used with either the 12 volt lineup from Skil or the 20 volt lineup. And if you can find a 20 volt Skil power adapter for their batteries, you can possibly use other tool batteries on this particular tool. Just remember, if you are adapting batteries, you do that at your own risk. And the second pro would be that it's small. This is a very lightweight, very compact light, and this means that it's easy to transport or just store in an area where you just don't have much space. Say you're living in an RV or an apartment or something like that. So quite frankly, this is another pro in my opinion. Runtime. Overall, the runtime is fairly good with this particular light, especially if you're using it on low. And even on high, you're still going to be getting about 5 hours of light with this particular tool. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a pro. And the next pro would be the USB port. While it isn't a fancy PD delivery USB port, the fact that it still has a USB port can be very useful, especially if you need to recharge other devices. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a pro. Collapsible. The collapsible diffuser can be very useful for when you're transporting this light or just need to extend the light in more of a 360 pattern around the light source. So as far as I'm concerned, this is still a pro. And the first meh would be the hook. The hook is made out of metal, which is good, but it's still a fairly soft metal that bends easily, which is sort of a bad. So it's kind of in the middle. It's not that great, it's not that bad, it's just kind of meh. And the first con would be tool availability. Currently in the year 2024, right after Christmas, the only way of buying this particular tool is in a $200 tool bundle set from Lowe's.com, and unfortunately, that's just not a great way of buying this particular tool. I really hope that they release this tool soon in a tool-only option so I can possibly pick up a couple more. So with that being said, availability is a con. And the next con would be price. Yes, since it's not currently being sold as anything other than a tool in a bundle set, I'm unable to tell you what the price is, and that is definitely a con. So at the end of the day, this is a con in my opinion. And last but not least, the diffuser can't be removed. It definitely would have been very useful to be able to remove the diffuser on this particular tool, but since you can't do that, I definitely consider it to be a con. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular light. Overall, this light has a lot going for it. The fact you can use it with two different power tool lineups, the fact that you have the USB port, and the fact that it's so compact are all definitely pros. Now, it's not a perfect light, and it definitely has some shortcomings such as the metal hook and the fact you can't remove the diffuser, but I think in a lot of different situations, this is going to be a very useful tool to have on hand, especially if you live somewhere where you lose power frequently because of natural disasters or just crappy power companies. Accidental energy. And so, quite frankly, I think that there's going to be a lot of different people who find this light very interesting to, well, buy. Currently, like I said earlier in the video, you can only buy this as part of a large tool pack, and it's about $200 to get the large tool pack. But I'm assuming that once they end up releasing a tool-only SKU for this particular tool, you should be able to purchase it, hopefully, at around the $25 to $35 price range. And at that particular price range, especially if it was closer to $25, this isn't a half-bad option to consider. So at the end of the day, I do recommend this particular tool, and if you want to buy it sooner than later, your only option, unfortunately, is that $200 toolkit from Lowe's, but then again, that's still an excellent value, so that's really not that big of a downside, as long as you have the money. So as far as I'm concerned, this tool comes recommended. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. God bless.